What if I told you that some people have faced sentences that most of us couldn't even imagine? Life behind bars for decades, but somehow, some way, they made it out. How did they survive? What twisted fate allowed them to walk free after spending more time in prison than most of us spend living our lives? Stay tuned, because you won't believe the stories behind these 10 incredible individuals who outlived some of the craziest prison sentences ever handed down. And wait until you hear about number 1, it's almost impossible to believe he survived at all. Number 10. Paul Geidel Jr., the man who served the longest prison sentence, 68 years. Paul Geidel Jr. was just 17 when he was convicted of second-degree murder in 1911, a teenager with a life sentence looming ahead of him. He would go on to serve an unimaginable 68 years behind bars, the longest prison sentence ever served in the United States. Think about that for a second, 68 years. That's nearly 7 decades of prison food, tiny cells, and watching the world change through prison bars. What's eerie about Paul? He never committed another crime and was actually eligible for parole many times, but refused to leave, preferring the safety of prison walls. When he was finally released at age 86, he had no family, no friends, nothing but the clothes on his back. He stepped out into a world that had left him behind. What could possibly be worse than that? Well, let's talk about number 9. Number 9. Joe Ligon, sentenced to life at 15, nearly 70 years behind bars. Joe Ligon was just 15 years old, barely old enough to drive, let alone to fully understand the consequences of his actions, when he was sentenced to life imprisonment for a crime spree in 1953. This was at a time when life without parole meant just that. But here's the twist: for years, Joe refused to be released on parole. Why? Joe believed that parole wasn't real freedom. For him, the only acceptable option was to walk out completely free or not at all. He spent 68 years in prison, only being released in 2021. Imagine walking out into a world where smartphones, the internet, and even color TVs didn't exist when you went in. His first step into freedom? Absolute shock. And yet, he survived it all. Number 8. Charles Fossard, Australia's oldest inmate, 71 years. Charles Fossard lived through it all. In 1926, he was convicted of murder and handed a life sentence in Australia, and that was just the beginning of his long stay. He would spend 71 years in prison, long enough to outlive most of the guards and fellow inmates he met along the way. Fossard even survived World War II from behind bars. But the eerie part? Charles had become so institutionalized that he had no idea how to function on the outside. His release came when he was in his 90s. He had no idea what to do with freedom. In fact, when he was released, he was so disoriented that the authorities had to place him in a nursing home just to adjust to life outside. Number 7. Albert Woodfox, solitary confinement for 43 years. Now, if you thought 70 years in prison was bad, wait until you hear about Albert Woodfox, a man who endured 43 years in solitary confinement. That's right, 43 years in a tiny cell with nothing but his own thoughts to keep him company. He was convicted of armed robbery and later for the murder of a prison guard. Woodfox and his fellow Angola 3 inmates maintained their innocence, but that didn't stop the punishment. He was finally released in 2016 after spending almost half a century completely isolated from human contact. How did he not go insane? That remains one of the biggest mysteries. Number 6. Otis Johnson, 44 years for shoplifting. When Otis Johnson was released after 44 years for the crime of shoplifting, the world had changed so much that it may as well have been another planet. He was convicted at age 25 in 1970 for an assault tied to a robbery. And by the time he got out in 2014, the world had moved on. Imagine stepping out of prison after more than 4 decades and seeing people with glowing rectangles, smartphones in their hands, driverless cars, and streets filled with electric billboards. Johnson described his first day out as nothing short of overwhelming. After all that time, he hadn't just survived prison, but an entire shift in society. Number 5. Frank Freshwater's The Real-Life Shawshank Redemption. Frank Freshwater's escaped from an Ohio prison farm in 1959 after serving just 2 years of a 20-year sentence. What followed was a real-life Shawshank Redemption story. He managed to avoid capture for almost 56 years, living under a fake identity in Florida. He was finally caught in 2015 after authorities reopened his cold case. How did a man manage to live freely for over 5 decades with the threat of recapture hanging over his head? His sentence was reduced, but that doesn't make his story any less eerie. Number 4. Robert Franklin Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz. Robert Stroud, aka the Birdman of Alcatraz, was one of the most notorious inmates in American history. He spent over 54 years in prison, 42 of them in solitary confinement. Why? After being convicted of manslaughter, he killed a prison guard, sealing his fate. But Stroud didn't let isolation stop him. From within his cell, he became an expert on bird diseases, publishing several books on the subject. He survived solitary confinement by finding a passion for something beyond his prison bars, something few others would have been able to do. Number 3. John Edward Robinson, the internet's first serial killer. A lifetime of death. John Edward Robinson was convicted in 2003 as one of the most twisted criminals in history, dubbed the internet's first serial killer. For nearly 2 decades, Robinson lured victims through online chat rooms before brutally murdering them. He is currently serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. What makes his case especially chilling is that despite being caught, several of his victims' bodies were never found. It's as if his secrets died with him, or rather live with him behind bars. Number 2. The Angola Three, nearly 30 years in solitary. The Angola Three, Herman Wallace, Robert King, and Albert Woodfox, each spent nearly 3 decades in solitary confinement at the infamous Louisiana State Penitentiary. Accused of murdering a guard, the three maintained their innocence. For nearly 30 years, they lived in cells no bigger than a parking space. Imagine living like that, without seeing another human being for decades. But that wasn't the worst of it. Some believe their solitary sentences were meant to silence their activism for civil rights. The question is, were they political prisoners, or did they truly commit the crime? Number 1 is Nanny Doss, the giggling granny. Don't let the nickname fool you. Doss was one of the most cold-blooded serial killers in American history, responsible for the deaths of at least 11 of her own family members. Her method? Poisoning them, and all while smiling and laughing through it. Though she was sentenced to life without parole, many still question how a grandmother could pull off such calculated murders for decades before being caught. Was it because people refused to believe someone so sweet-looking could be so sinister? She died in prison in 1965, but her story continues to haunt. So, what does it take to survive a prison sentence that most would say is a fate worse than death? Is it mental fortitude, a twisted acceptance, or simply the cruel march of time? These 10 individuals lived through something few of us will ever experience, yet their stories force us to confront something uncomfortable. When does justice become cruelty? And how far can the human spirit bend before it breaks? If you thought these stories were wild, wait until you hear about the ones that remain untold.